The palace did not shake because a crown was taken. It shook because a name disappeared. One minute, Queen Camilla stood inside the royal machinery as a central figure beside King Charles. The next, her name was removed from a royal decree signed by Charles and Princess Anne, turning a private document into a devastating signal that something inside the monarchy had finally broken. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the final page in front of him, and for a long moment the king did not reach for the pen. He read the same line twice, then looked at the empty space where Camilla's name had once stood, as if the paper itself had accused him of choosing the crown over the woman beside him. The royal decree, an official written order used to confirm authority, access, and future palace decisions, was supposed to settle questions about household control, ceremonial planning, and who would be included in sensitive royal business. Instead, it became the document that exposed a fracture no one inside the palace could soften. Camilla's name had been removed from the final version before the monarch and Anne signed it, and that single change turned protocol into punishment. Across the palace, the Queen Consort received the news in a private sitting room, and she did not explode, did not demand explanations, and did not call for Charles at once. She simply went still, wounded first by the silence, then by the realization that everyone around her seemed to know how serious it was before she did. Anne's signature beside her brother's gave the decree a force that could not be dismissed as clerical tidying or palace confusion. The princess had not merely witnessed the decision, she had helped seal it. A senior aide handling the revised document after the signing noticed that the spacing had been formally adjusted, where Camilla's name had been removed. And in that cold detail, the truth became impossible to deny. This was not an accidental omission. This was not a hurried correction. This was a deliberate removal, prepared carefully enough that the paper no longer carried even the ghost of her place. Charles set the pen down after signing, and the sound felt heavier than any speech he could have given. Camilla sat in silence. Anne stood firm in duty, and the decree began moving through the palace like a warning dressed as order. But to understand why one missing name could wound so deeply, the story must move from the document itself to the people whose lives were trapped inside it. Behind every royal decree, there are faces the public never sees. A king carrying guilt, a queen fighting for dignity, and a princess who has spent a lifetime choosing duty over comfort. This was not simply about Camilla's place in a document. It was about Charles, Anne, and the invisible line between loyalty to a spouse and loyalty to the crown. Charles felt the weight before a single word was spoken. The monarch, the reigning king responsible for protecting the stability of the crown and its institutions, knew this decision would not stay private for long, even if it was being discussed behind closed doors. The palace was already divided in tone, even if no one said it out loud. One wrong signature could shift trust across the entire royal household, and he understood that better than anyone sitting in that room. Anne did not move when the conversation began. The princess, a senior royal figure known for discipline, continuity, and unwavering duty, listened with the kind of silence that often ended arguments before they fully formed. Her presence carried two pressures at once: family loyalty and institutional responsibility. Every pause from her felt like judgment, even when she said nothing. Charles spoke carefully in a private audience with Anne, his voice lower than usual, as if volume itself might tip the balance. He tried to explain what Camilla meant to him and what her presence stabilised in his personal world. Anne did not interrupt once. She only watched him, steady and controlled, as if weighing emotion against consequence in real time. Camilla sat alone in another wing of the palace, unaware of the exact words, but fully aware of the distance forming around her. She had lived this feeling before, accepted in ceremony, questioned in silence, and it pressed on her again with the same quiet sting. The Queen Consort, the monarch's spouse whose public role supports ceremonial duties and representation, waited without knowing whether she was being included in the future or being edited out of it. Anne finally spoke with clarity, stating that the decree could not carry Camilla's name if the institution wanted to avoid deeper division inside the household. The words were not loud, but they landed with finality. Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly and asked what the monarchy itself would lose if the decision was reversed, as if searching for a space where both loyalty and duty could survive together. It was not refusal, not agreement, but something more dangerous: uncertainty from a king who had always been expected to decide without delay. Anne noticed it instantly, but said nothing more. And somewhere beyond those walls, Camilla's future began shifting without her presence in the conversation that would define it. And that pause did not appear from nowhere. It was born from a hidden backstory the palace had tried to bury before it reached this breaking point. Every palace crisis has a moment people later pretend was smaller than it was. For this one, it happened during a private Commonwealth reception rehearsal at Windsor, when a seating plan, a ceremonial order, and one sharp exchange behind closed doors changed everything. What looked like protocol became personal, and what sounded like correction became the trigger for royal retaliation. Tension had been building for weeks inside Windsor, where preparations for the Commonwealth reception, a formal gathering of member nations under the Crown, used to reinforce unity and diplomatic ties, were meant to run with precision and silence. But silence had already cracked. Camilla's growing involvement in ceremonial planning had begun to unsettle long-established boundaries, and every revised document felt like a quiet shift in power. Camilla stepped into the rehearsal room with confidence that came from familiarity, but the air did not respond to it. The Queen Consort, the monarch's spouse who supports ceremonial duties and represents continuity beside the crown, saw immediately that the seating plan had changed again. Anne stood across the table, already holding the revised order, as if she had expected this moment before anyone else arrived. Camilla did not hide her frustration during the Windsor rehearsal, while senior aides watched in uneasy silence. She pointed at the seating arrangement and challenged the revised procession order, asking why her position had been shifted without consultation. Anne did not raise her voice. She simply folded the paper once, slowly, as if closing a chapter that did not need permission to end. Anne finally spoke with calm precision, telling Camilla that tradition cannot be rewritten to soothe personal insecurity. The princess, a senior royal figure defined by discipline, duty, and loyalty to institutional structure, did not blink as she delivered the line. The room tightened instantly. Even the aides stopped breathing normally because everyone understood that this was no longer about seating. Camilla's expression changed in real time. Her confidence faltered as she realized the silence around her had become heavier than any argument. She turned slightly, expecting Charles to step in, to soften the moment, to restore balance, but the king did not move. The monarch remained still, watching, measuring, and saying nothing that could reverse what had already been said. A private briefing note later recorded the exchange at Windsor, written by a senior aide who described the moment as a breach of discipline rather than a disagreement over protocol. That note reached Charles quietly, without ceremony, and reframed the entire rehearsal as something more serious than tension. It framed it as instability inside the royal household itself. After the rehearsal, aides began quietly reviewing Camilla's place in upcoming decrees and ceremonial structures, marking which roles were essential and which were expandable. No one announced it, no one needed to. The shift had already begun in silence, where real decisions are made long before signatures appear. And Windsor, once just a rehearsal space, had now become the point where the consequences began. Once that rehearsal became the hidden trigger, the palace was no longer managing discomfort. It was preparing for confrontation. The confrontation did not happen in public, and that made it more dangerous. No cameras, no recorders softening the words, no official smiles to hide the damage. Camilla and Anne faced each other in a private room where every sentence carried years of history. And by the time the door closed behind them, both women understood that only one version of royal authority would survive. Camilla stepped into the palace room first, her presence steady but controlled, aware that this was not a casual discussion, but a final stage before the decree was locked. The Queen Consort, the monarch's spouse whose role supports ceremonial duty and public continuity, already sensed that the structure around her had shifted before a single word was spoken. The silence in the room was not empty, it was prepared. Anna followed without hesitation, her posture unchanged, as if she had already carried this conversation in her mind long before it began. The princess, a senior royal figure representing discipline, institutional loyalty, and continuity of the crown, did not need to announce her position. It was already embedded in the way she stood, the way she looked at Camilla, and the way she did not rush to fill the silence with explanation. Camilla spoke first, her voice controlled but sharp, asking directly whether Anne had pushed for her name to be removed from the decree. The question landed without decoration, without softness. She did not look away as she spoke, holding the weight of years during which acceptance had always come with conditions, never certainty. And in that moment, the room felt smaller, as if every wall were listening. Camilla's control cracked slightly as she continued, saying she had endured years of judgment from outside and inside the palace, only to feel the deepest fracture come from within. The Queen Consort spoke with restrained emotion, revealing how deeply the constant negotiation of her place had worn her down, especially when loyalty never seemed to guarantee security. Her words did not rise, but they cut deeper because of how quietly they were delivered. Anne did not react quickly. She remained composed, almost severe, letting the silence settle before responding. When she finally spoke, her tone carried the weight of institutional memory, not personal emotion. The princess reminded Camilla that endurance does not automatically translate into authority over the crown's future machinery, the structured system of roles, approvals, and ceremonial control that keeps the monarchy functioning without division. Camilla stepped closer to the table, placing her hand on its edge, her breathing controlled but heavier now. She asked whether Charles had agreed before or after Anne demanded her removal from the decree, searching not only for facts, but for reassurance, for proof that she had not been erased without hesitation. The question exposed the real fracture beneath the surface, not just between the two women, but within the royal triangle itself. Anne did not deny her involvement. She did not soften it either. Instead, she revealed that the king understood the decree could not survive if it carried divided authority, that the monarchy could not project unity while internally splitting influence across competing roles. Her words were not defensive, they were final, as if the decision had already passed the point of reversal long before Camilla entered the room. Camilla went still at that admission because the argument was no longer about Anne alone. It was about Charles, about what he had accepted without standing beside her in the moment it mattered most. And that realization shifted everything in the room, turning confrontation into anticipation, because neither woman was prepared for what would happen when the king finally walked in and the balance of loyalty broke completely. And when Charles finally stepped into that room, the silence between husband and wife became more powerful than anything Anne had said. Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself with raised voices. It appears in signatures, margins, pauses, and the order in which names are allowed to stand. When Charles and Anne signed the decree without Camilla's name, the palace understood the message instantly. Affection could remain private, but authority had been redrawn in ink, and no one could pretend otherwise. Charles held the pen without speaking, his stillness heavier than any command he could have given. The king, the monarch whose signature defines royal authority and validates official decisions, the crown, understood that this decree would not just organise structure, it would redefine influence inside the royal household. Two grounding realities pressed on him at once: the need to protect institutional unity and the personal cost of reshaping someone he loved into absence on paper. Anne watched without interruption, her presence steady and deliberate, as if she had already accepted the weight of what this moment would cost. The princess, a senior royal figure responsible for upholding discipline and continuity within the monarchy, represented a different kind of authority, one built on restraint and consequence. She understood that removing Camilla's name did not erase her role personally, but it did limit her formal influence over household decisions, ceremonial access, and internal approvals tied to the decree. Charles signed first. The movement was slow, controlled, and final, but then his hand stopped for a fraction of a second, hovering just above the table as his eyes locked onto the empty space where Camilla's name should have been. That silence mattered more than the signature itself because it exposed the tension between duty and loyalty in a way no public speech ever could. Anne signed next without hesitation, her pen firm against the page. But beneath that firmness was something quieter, something almost unspoken. She understood what it cost him. She also understood what it cost her. Every line she confirmed carried the reality that family ties were being measured again, institutional survival, and survival was winning. The sealed folder closed with a final sound that felt sharper than expected. An aide stepped forward and was instructed clearly that no alternate version of the decree was to remain in circulation, not even in draft form. The instruction was not loud, but it was absolute, reinforcing that the decision was no longer negotiable at any level of the palace. A private notation attached to the file confirmed what everyone already felt, but no one needed to say aloud. The removal had been approved at the highest level of authority. That detail ended every possibility of blaming confusion, paperwork errors, or miscommunication. It made the decision permanent in a way silence never could. Charles did not look up as the folder was taken away. Anne did not speak as it left the room. And somewhere beyond those doors, the absence of a name was already becoming something irreversible. Once the signed version left the room, Camilla no longer faced a rumour. She faced a new royal reality. The decree had been signed. The ink had dried, and the first person to feel its force was the woman whose name had vanished. The cruelest part of royal punishment is that it often arrives politely. No public accusation, no shouted order, just a change in access, a missing briefing, a chair no longer waiting in the right room. For Camilla, the fallout began not with scandal outside the gates, but with a quiet evening inside the palace, when she realised the machinery had already moved on without her. Camilla felt it first in the smallest absence. The Queen Consort, the monarch's spouse, whose role traditionally includes participation in ceremonial coordination and internal briefings, noticed that the evening schedule had changed without explanation. The briefing tied to the decree's new authority structure went ahead without her invitation, and that absence mattered more than any spoken rejection, because it marked a shift in how decisions were now being filtered around her. Camilla moved through the palace corridors with quiet disbelief as staff adjusted schedules and replaced documents on clipped boards. The signed decree, the formal royal order defining household authority and ceremonial control, had already begun reshaping daily operations. Meeting papers were redistributed, access lists were revised, and names that once opened doors now required secondary approval before being acknowledged. Camilla stopped at her tray when she noticed the missing folder. Her hand hovered above the empty space where it should have been, and she asked an aide why the briefing pack was no longer there. The aide hesitated, unable to meet her eyes, offering no clear answer beyond carefully chosen silence. In that moment, Camilla understood that hesitation itself had become the new language of the palace. Charles arrived later, and his presence carried both comfort and distance at the same time. The king, the monarch responsible for both emotional unity and institutional stability, spoke gently, but every word felt measured, as if even affection had to pass through caution before reaching her. Camilla listened and realised the apology was careful in a way that revealed more than it hid. The husband had come, but the crown had arrived first. Camilla began to see it clearly after that conversation. Anne's influence had not simply removed her name from a decree, it had changed how she existed inside the system itself. The princess, a senior royal figure whose authority is rooted in discipline and institutional continuity, had set in motion a reaction that made staff treat Camilla's presence as conditional rather than automatic. Every glance, every pause, every unanswered question confirmed it. A senior courtier later spoke to Charles in a private recorded briefing note, stating that the decree had already been distributed across enough offices that any reversal would now appear unstable. That warning carried weight, because it came not as opinion but as institutional reality, reflecting how quickly the change had embedded itself into the structure of palace operations. Charles stood quietly after hearing it, and Camilla understood without being told that the walls had already shifted too far to pretend otherwise. Yet the deepest shift was still ahead, waiting for the moment when protocol finally stepped back and left only truth in the room. Only after the palace machinery had done its work did the human cost emerge in the one conversation no decree could control. For once, there was no throne between them, no advisors, no ceremony, and no royal language polished enough to soften the wound. Charles and Camilla sat across from each other as husband and wife. But the decree lay between them like a third presence. In that private moment, the monarchy's decision became something more devastating, a marriage forced to face the limits of power. Charles did not speak at first because silence was the only thing that did not feel like a mistake. The king, the monarch whose signature binds royal authority,